we're moving on to this discussion about the value of diversity in the curriculum, and quite a lot of those issues about transculturalism are interesting in relation to this. But what the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to sort of throw three topicy kind of almost questions, but mostly sort of topics into the ring and ask Mike Loudon and Luis to respond to them. They have had some prior notice, but not much of what the questions will be. So, but also feel free to chuck in comments and questions in the chat from anyone else. And if you'd like to, ask a question face to face, maybe stick it in or stick a note in the chat saying you want to, and we can bring you in. So the first thing that I wanted to sort of throw out there was the question of whether we need a canon at all. Given that we all agree, or well, I'm assuming kind of that we all agree, that the repertoire used in teaching needs to be more diverse and representative. What do we think about the idea of a canon? And should we aim to reflect the musical tastes of our student demographic? Or should we be deciding that there are certain things that they should know? And how do we set that balance? I don't know who wants to jump in as with that.
Well, I'll start. I think there are certain things that they should know or should at least become broadly aware of. But I also think that we need to consider what we are conveying when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because the words are frequently used, but the intent behind them is often quite different. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on delivery of course subject matter and creation of curriculum. Because, of course, there's a big difference between presence, a physical presence, or a theoretical ideological presence, and active participation. So diversity and inclusion, I think, need to be more clearly defined for, in specific contexts. It's my 2 cents.
Good. I'd like to talk about a little bit about the canon. So the question, first of all, it's pretty good to be here. I'm so glad to see all of you. Even I am seeing just some names on my screen, but it's a great pleasure. Thanks, Simon, for this invitation. Thanks, Marta, for set up this kind of meeting between me and Simon, and it's a great pleasure to meet all of you. So the question, Simon sent us a lot of questions, and I asked him before how many days we have to try to answer these questions, but we have just something like 1 hour. And so the first question is about canon, and the first topics. Do we need a canon? I think that in some sense, as humans, human beings, yes. I don't know if we need a canon, but even when we are trying to be anti-canonic in some sense, we are always creating some other types of canons. I'd like to mention, for example, the reality of Brazilian popular music in higher education these days, or specific programs in Brazilian popular music undergraduate programs. And in general, although we change the type of music that we teach, the types of music, we are trying to incorporate a diversity of different types of Brazilian popular music. We always elect a kind of canon to teach. In Brazil, it implies teach samba, choro, sometimes of umbrella genre that we call Brazilian popular music, but in some sense, it is a kind of exclusive concept. It's not exactly a genre, but a set of genres that we valorize in Brazilian popular music. And from this point of view, I could mention the American jazz. We have a lot of Latin America influence in American music these days, but in general, they are not included in undergraduate programs and things like that. And so I think that the question is, in fact, I believe that the main point, if we are aware of that, if you are aware that we create canons, we have to reassess our music programs and our music teaching continuously, pushing ourselves to diversity by defining some canons that we've been following. So it implies the problem in Brazilian higher education these days, it is because we are still so hold on to traditional canons of Western classical music. So we are trying to incorporate other types of canons by taking into account Brazilian popular music. And right now, in these types of specific programs, Brazilian popular music programs, we are trying to incorporate other types of music that are not exactly the canons of Brazilian popular music. I think that the problem is not we have some canons, but when these canons are completely limited, especially just encompassing some types of repertoires and some types of music.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So I think I broadly agree with both Mike and Luis. I think my inclination has always been anti-canonical, but as Luis pointed out, even when you're anti-canonical, you're acting against a canon. I think that as that question, I think can add knowledge base among a musical community. I mean, I think we need some kind of shared knowledge as a starting point. The challenge, I think, is how we use those canons, how those canons become spaces or scaffoldings for positions of power, which is what has happened. So I think that's a really difficult challenge, is how you, because ultimately the question is what is in that canon and what is outside, and that becomes a question related to questions of power. So yeah, that's my response. I think I think we probably do need canons of some kind, but it's how we manage those. The other question about reflecting students' musical tastes and whether that canon should reflect musical tastes. I mean, that's a complex question because, of course, our students may have very diverse and eclectic musical tastes. But I think as an educator, my role is very much about opening horizons and exposing students to things that they may not have experienced. So I would say not necessarily. That our role is not necessarily to reflect the musical tastes, but yeah, I don't know what the end of that sentence is. I think students need to be able to identify with the things that we're teaching them, but we need to also stretch them and take them beyond that. Yeah, that's me.
Mike, can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit on, you talked about the difference between presence and participation. I mean, I can get a sense of that, but have you got any sort of specific thoughts about what it means for people in mind? Something a bit.
Well, I suppose one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of curriculum and delivery of material is and the fact.
Sorry, you broke up. Oh, you
broke up.
You've frozen again. Could you? Yeah. I don't know if that happened for everybody, but it happened for me.
Can you hear me clearly at the moment? Okay. All right. Yes. One of the things I was thinking about was my role as a foreign black male professor in the American South during the Trump administration, and some time before that during the Bush administration. All of these things affect the reception of the delivery of the material. I mean, consider, I may be straying from the scope of the question that you've asked, but ultimately it's going to come back to the core of it. Consider the situation wherein I'm going into a history of the recording industry class at this point. And I'm talking about blackface. That's going to be the first topic in the course. What I'm getting at is that my students' reception is going to be very different from those of my white colleagues, partly because of the overall cultural and political environment, but also because of the medium, of delivery. So when we talk about, coming back to your specific question now, the issue of the difference between physical presence and active participation, even discussing the issue of blackface may be perceived as revolutionary or counter-establishment, even though it's just a standard part of the course. So what I'm suggesting is that the physical presence doesn't operate outside of the cultural and political circumstances that frame the delivery of the material.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot more sense. It felt a little diffuse before, but that's very specific and very clear. Yeah. Any responses from that from the others, or other points that you'd like to make?
I do just to students, and I think that I totally agree in some sense, and I believe that it's really important to incorporate musical tastes and musical interests of our students, but also it's really important to give them the opportunity to explore and know a large set of local and in music making. I think that when we incorporate other types of activities beyond that tastes, we are incorporate discussion about diversity in a diversified sense. I mean, we are talking about music linked to anti-racism. We are talking about, for example, in Brazil, used in local indigenous community. And so we create this kind of atmosphere to understand and to interact with diversity beyond the spherical and sonorous aspects. I mean, and I think that it is what Mike would like to say when he's talking about this interactivity. You are learning more than just rhythm, melodies, harmonies, and things like that. So when we are just working on musical tastes of our students, we have a problem, because in some sense we are keeping them hold on to the values that they already have, and it's more than musical, or at least spherical aspects. I think that they should be included in a large debate about, for example, in Brazil. I'd like to mention that if Mike has Trump in the United States, I have Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's very similar. And we start in Brazil to have problems with racism, chauvinism, a lot of problems with indigenous communities, because our government is stimulating this kind of issues, social issues. And I think that music diversity and a curriculum based on diversity is really important to get over this type of problems beyond the experience to play and to understand a large set of musical possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I wanted to come back to the sort of in the third question, to the idea of how ideology or polemics feed into what we do as educators, because I mean, in some ways, what we're saying here is, you know, by saying we are anti-canonical, but there is a direction of diversity that we want to go in. It's obviously an ideological statement, and that we're counteracting a previous ideological statement that was about a narrower form of canon. So, well, maybe seeing as nobody in the audience at the moment is putting direct questions in, maybe if we go on to the second one, then we can come back afterwards. But so where I was going to go next was this idea of, should we be trusting students to generate their own repertoire? So because another thing that I mentioned in the email that I sent you was the idea that we're talking about this in quite general terms, but there are a lot of different courses that students are going on, and different courses have different uses for repertoire and different reasons for including it, and some of those reasons may be about technical know-how, about doing something better against a set of criteria, or it may be if they're learning about historical musicology, should they be creating their own stylistic timelines, and with analysis, should they be damn, just lost my notes, there it is, should they be finding their own particular examples to relate to particular ideas or concepts that we're wanting them to understand? So I mean, the two examples I put in the question were find their own examples of epistemic violence or oppression, or particular rhyming structures in songs, depending on how, you know, we could go any kind of direction with that. But the question, I suppose, is should we be encouraging students to develop their canon, or perhaps a little less polemically, their own repertoire lists?
Who wants to go first? I can go first.
Go ahead.
I mean, yes, I would say yes, absolutely. I think that obviously it goes without saying that we are encouraging students to develop their own critical faculties, which also means generating their own repertoire lists. But I think we equip them with the skills to know what they're doing. We should be equipping them with the skills. So if they're developing their own kind of, I don't know if canonic is the right word here. I mean, that it's perhaps we need some other kind of terminology. But so, for example, if we're talking about classical performers, encouraging them, thinking about diversity, for example. So, for example, I know some institutions have done this. We've instituted prizes for the best performance of a work by a female composer in final recitals, for example, to encourage students to explore sorry, that wasn't a good example for this particular conference, but it's the one that just came to mind. But you know, you could find similar examples. So as a way of encouraging them to diversify their own canons, if you like. So I think the answer to your question of whether we should, yes, absolutely, with guidance and with the skills that we're hopefully developing in them. That would be my response.
Yeah, I guess whether we should is a bit of a stupid question, really. It's more of a how would you do that in a way that makes sense, and you've kind of gone there with that, which is.
So I'm not sure what the example would, because we don't teach popular music performance. So maybe others have got better examples of how that might work in terms of a broader diversity of repertoire.
Well, you know, whenever anyone mentions canons, of course, my mind always goes to the physical canon with its different spelling, and the whole metaphor of ignition, which I think is what we as educators are intended to provide, with varying degrees of explosive. But ultimately, for example, and this may not be the best example, but when I think about discussing reggae music in class, how can we possibly deal with that without providing some kind of post-colonial historical framework? We have to bring something to the table that facilitates and enables perception, comprehension, and analysis of that material within a very specific and relevant context. Now, that can be a point of departure for the students, but we still have to create some sort of foundation, some starting point that's tangible and relevant.
That's it. I think that it's a wonderful point, Mike. I do believe that we have to decide things together by exploring different options and alternatives. It implies we shouldn't decide all things for students, but set up some experience to research, to experience, to emerge in a diversified set of repertoire and experience. And it includes, in some sense, you bring some foundations, some questions to be discussed, some repertoires to be explored in a large sense. And I think that research in a large sense is a great strategy, because you promote more than musical experience. In fact, you promote this kind of interest in discovering about Brazilian popular music history, and we're gonna identify that it was really colonized in the past, and we still have these traits of coloniality. We discovered that we teach Western classical music and just it in a lot of great universities in Brazil because of this process of colonization. It was a way to civilize the society. So they have another way to interact, for example, with classical musical repertoires when they have this kind of knowledge, and they have another way to interact with Brazilian popular music when they realize that it is part of an amazing process of coloniality, epistemics, and exclusions. It implies that, for example, we have Black students in our program here at the university, and we have a large program of music, different types of programs. And some Black students are saying right now, after a research that we conducted in Afro-Brazilian music, that they had no idea that for a long time, this type of music was completely excluded from the universities. And so right now they are playing this type of music, and they are acting like activists to promote interaction, to valorize, to talk about this type of music. And the first question that when we started to work on this research was something like, what do you know about Black Brazilian composers? And they discovered that they didn't have any kind of knowledge about it. From this point of view, from this first question, they started to ask themselves, who are the Black Brazilian composers that we should study a little bit more? What kind of composition they composed specifically? What kind of Black influence, what kind of African, Afro-Brazilian influence this type of music has, and things like that. So I think that is always this process of interaction, because on their own, they wouldn't decide to study this type of repertoire initially, because they didn't have this kind of question. It wasn't a problem from their point of view, because in general, we don't study this kind of thing in schools of music, traditional schools of music, and even in our history, when we study in elementary school, high school, in general, we don't talk about this type of problems. It is improving a lot over this last 20 years, but it is something that we still have to explore, for example, in Brazil, in Latin America, in general, in South America, and everywhere, I think.
Yeah, and that sort of problem of invisibility of things that you don't know about, and that's where we can come in to some extent. But that sort of problem of invisibility is interesting, because it also reflects. I'm just thinking about the way this relates to some of the comments that have been made in the chat about encouraging people in particular directions and being a kind of guide rather than rather than just providing materials, being a guide to in a search process. But knowing what is invisible to them is an important part of being an educator, and being able to point people in the right direction. But it's also, it sort of exposes our own limitations, in that I mean, since I started teaching in 1998, around then, I've relied more or less exclusively on my students to introduce me to new forms of music, rather than me being able to follow culture on a kind of grassroots level, because I'm just old and not able to do it, basically. What's also interesting about that is that they need to feel themselves as visible contributors to my education, as well as vice versa. I was talking to my wife last night about how we were going to have this discussion, and we were talking about, she's a visual artist, so we were talking about repertoire in the visual arts as well as this, and we had a long discussion, and she did point out that she was going to be the invisible party in this process, that you know, I'm going to be saying a lot of things that are actually a sort of co-production, if you like. So just citing my wife as a influential source in this, whatever I've said, basically. But yeah, I mean, that that idea of visibility and citation, and how that provides value to both in terms of what the students feel about their contribution, but also it goes back to what you were saying, Mike, about the difference between presence and participation, that that it's about becoming part of the process, I suppose.
Could I say something, Simon? Sorry. So I think there's also, as well as questions of canon in relation to repertoire, there's another aspect of canon which I don't know if we're also referring to, which are things like scholarly sources, for example. So Britta referred to the work of Wolfgang Welsch, which I hadn't come across before, and I think particularly for those of us in English language speaking countries, there's also issues of canon in relation to the literature that we're giving our students to read as well, I think, which we need to think about. Obviously, partly because of language barriers, that's a problem. The other thing I was going to say was I absolutely agree with you that we should be co-producing knowledge with our students. I think the increasing neoliberalization of higher education, as I've seen it in the UK, increasingly makes that more difficult, because students come in paying a lot of money to buy effectively what is kind of a product, and they want us to fill them with knowledge. And it's a very different way of thinking about what education is about, actually. So the transactional nature of it, I think, impacts on how they expect us to be teaching them.
Yeah, the transactional nature and the idea of themselves as a vessel and knowledge as a thing that gets poured into them. That's a really important metaphor. And what a couple of people have mentioned what Hetty said earlier on. Hetty said, isn't it more appropriate to focus on methods, skills that we teach rather than on content and repertoire? That does relate very specifically to the last question that I wanted to pose, but I suppose we could go there and then we can just start getting messy after that, because we've got a fair amount of time left. And that for me is the question of how does our choice of, and again this relates to what you've just said, Loudon, about literature, because it's about theoretical models and tools of analysis that we may or may not have access to because of the canon of literature that we do connect with, and yes, language is one thing, but also disciplinarity is another. It's been, because I kind of don't fit into a nice neat category as far as subject area. I did my PhD in electroacoustic composition, and then went into sort of science and technology studies, and also got interested in ecological approaches to perception. So I've got this kind of weird combination of disciplines, all of which say very similar things about stuff, but with different language and with different nuances to it. So a lot of the stuff about embodied cognition and the idea of the idea of embodied cognition relates very strongly to affect theory, that is kind of more of a musicology thing, and also very strongly to Dennis Smalley's spectromorphology, which is a sort of electroacoustic language of electroacoustic music thing. And those three areas of discipline are sets of tools, analytical tools, that the structure of them, the nature of them, creates different sets of questions, allows you to ask questions in different ways. I've got off the wording that I was using before, but so I was saying, how much does the choice of analytical tools determine or reflect the repertoire and the ideologies that inform that repertoire, but also the whole subject area about methodologies. So choosing to do a Schenkerian analysis of harmonic forms is based on a very different ideology of what is important than an analysis of microtiming or groove. And likewise, something like a kind of feminist user-focused theory from technology studies, like I can't remember anyone's name suddenly because I've put myself on the spot, so I'm going to move away from that rather rapidly. That reflects a different ideology than, say, a post-colonial approach about epistemic violence, Foucault, and the tools. Going back to sort of Hetty's question, the tools, therefore, are also an ideology that structures the way we think in the same way that the repertoire does, I suppose. So again, I've just asked the question, how much does it, which is a really stupid way of phrasing the question because I was writing in a hurry. But anything you'd like to say about this topic rather than answering that question would be good.
Well, I suppose whatever we're doing, we're going to be joined in some way, connected in some way to our ideological backgrounds and biases. And we have to be conscious of those and try to find ways to expand our own ideological boundaries in ways that invite the students to do the same. But certainly where popular music is concerned, again, the post-colonial issue becomes very important as, from my perspective, conveying another way among many, many possible ways of perceiving the music, its purpose, its direction, its origins, and influences. So when we're talking about analytical tools, I think we should probably be encouraged to use those that come most easily to us, while also making some reference to many which are a little less familiar.
Good point. So I would say that we have a lot of problems to set up our curricula or different types of curricula these days because we have different types of programs. And in general, we had in the past some common courses like ear training, music theory, and things like that. As we increased a lot the set of repertoires and types of music that we've been working on these days, we have something like 7 different types of undergraduate programs, and all of them work on different types of concepts and types of music and perspectives of performers, analysis, and things like that. I think that the main problem that we've been facing right now, it is because we discovered that the traditional way to work on ear training is not enough to work on ear training that we need linked to Brazilian popular music, for example, or to work in kinds of traditional, Brazilian traditional music that follow other types of perspectives. Although you have a type of perception that you need to develop, to have theories, they are completely different. So I think that the answer is yes, the repertoire is it's the base of this historical, theoretical, analytical knowledge that we've been worked on for a long time. And for this reason, maybe we should have different types of proposals, different type of curricula to incorporate other theories, other analytical tools, other ear training classes. We are using other types of names to define this set of classes. And I think that we've been working these days on other types of questions. For example, we incorporated a lot of repertoires, a lot of different types of music, but we are using the same discipline and course-based curriculum. It is a big deal because if we would like to teach Afro-Brazilian music, we should incorporate that off-campus activities are part of this process, and more important, to work engaged than in fact classes into the campus. And so our new music popular program, you have something like 30% of the workload is off campus. And we are trying to interact the students with the performances, the composition process. They are trying to play other types of instruments, not exactly the main one that they are studying. If you are a guitarist, but you'd like to play Afro-Brazilian music from Bahia, you should play different types of drums because it is the way that you have to understand the rhythmic structure and things like that. So, and in the future, our plan is something like 20% of the program into the campus and 80% off, because we learn music, or at least these different types of music, connecting with them, engaging, in fact, in these practices. And it implies, in fact, other tools, other theories, other histories, other perspectives to teach and learn. And it is something that we've been working on in Brazil, because we discovered that for a long time, if you change the repertoire, but you keep the same curricular model, you have a lot of problems, in fact, to teach this different music. And the tendency is like, you're gonna teach another song, you're gonna teach another piece by using the same way that you used for a long time to teach Western classical repertoire. And it's not possible you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the model of teaching Western classical repertoire could do with having that same kind of approach, in terms of a kind of situated learning approach, rather than the sort of isolated conservatoire. I think it's one of its problems at the moment. But yeah, so Loudon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have a great deal to add to what's been said. I mean, I think obviously it goes without saying that the analytical approaches that we employ inevitably reflect the canonical traditions of our particular areas of training and discipline. So we bring those with us. And, you know, scholarship is obviously not ideologically free. We know that. And the same goes for our analytical techniques. So that they're very deeply implicated ideologically, I think. And thinking about the discussion, what Luis was just saying about, it made me think about the ways in which, you know, all the discussions around curricular diversity. For me, one of the big central problems, so I'm going a bit off track here, but I think it relates to some of the earlier points. One of the big problems is, you know, we have a university curriculum in the UK by and large, which started off focused on Western art music and has diversified kind of in a rather piecemeal way. So things kind of, you tinker at the edges and you add things on. And we've never really, I don't know, I can't speak for every music department, every institution, but certainly that's been my experience by and large. Whereas probably what we need is a kind of rethink of the whole thing, building up from the ground, from scratch. That doesn't have Western art music as the kind of normative starting point as it is for many degrees, with a bit of world music and popular music thrown in. I know that may not apply for every single course, but it kind of characterises quite a lot of what's happened in the UK, I think. Sorry, that wasn't an answer to your question, but it's a broader anxiety, I guess, about the whole diversity discourse, which doesn't really address the underlying systemic problems with our curriculum.
No, I agree, and I think I mean, I think what's interesting is, and maybe this is true of the kind of newer music departments in the States as well, Mike, that that with the sort of post-92 universities in the UK and places like MTSU and Massachusetts Lowell that have developed recording arts and music industry and creative production and performance, where they haven't had a classical tradition necessarily behind them, or at least where those departments have been kind of superseded by others, that generally there isn't the time or the space to do what you've just suggested, Loudon, which would be a great thing to do, to actually, you know, sit and have a big discussion about what would be a good way to do that.
I mean, it is time and space, but there's also a lot of we would find a lot of resistance from certain quarters to doing that, because a lot of people are very happy with the status quo.
Yeah, no, indeed, and I mean, West London sort of sits in between two worlds, in that it's the older London College of Music Conservatoire thing, but that's become much smaller, and the other departments have grown in contrast to it. So there is space for change, and we've been making a lot of change, but it's just not the time and the kind of there isn't the kind of mental energy in the sector, I think, to say, well, we've got to reinvent ourselves. Let's do it. But I think in a lot of ways that is partly what we're talking about here, because it's not going to happen without a kind of major reshuffle. Otherwise, we are tinkering on the edges. There was something I was going to say that has slipped my mind.
There are some good questions in the chat. Hetty's asking whether there are lessons we can learn from Brazil, given that there's been so much innovation there.
Lewis, what do you think about lessons that we can learn from Brazil?
Great. I am trying to read here. Just a second. So I would say that we have tried to incorporate some new perspectives about curricula in plural, in fact, because we've been working on perspectives that that points out something like, it's not possible we have a kind of model that for a long time was the reality in Brazil. Like every single university around the country in different regions, for example, some pretty close to the Amazon, was teaching by using the same curriculum model than we had in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, southern Brazil, and things like that. I think these days we are trying to incorporate different perspectives to set up the curriculum and to introduce, to include other types of repertoire. And especially, I would say that we have some new proposals in the Northeast regarding these perspectives to teach, creating strategies to interact our students to the context that they are studying. I mean, for example, Marta, who is attending our meeting here, has written a lot of papers about different Brazilian popular music genres. But for example, we have a lot of amazing genres in the Northeast, and we have never studied them. It implies, and I have read before a question on the chat, someone asked about research. I think that research is the secret because, for example, we have frevo. It is a kind of Brazilian genre so popular in Recife, in Northeast, pretty popular because of the carnival and things like that in the Northeast. But we don't have music history that includes, in fact, frevo. And so what we have been working on here in Paraíba, for example, is try to engage our students in research, first of all, and write this kind of histories. And we have different types of perspectives to work on different types of music. So I think that research is a great strategy to know something that we don't know, we still don't know, and to create some other strategies to teach by incorporating not only the spherical aspect of this type of music, but ways that they use to teach, ways that they use to perform these repertoires locally in their own communities and things like that. I would say that we have some new proposals in Northeast. We can change some ideas. Who is interested in, I can share my email, and we've been trying to make things different in Brazil because of our needs. We faced for a long time problems. I don't know if everywhere knows, but in Brazil, public education is completely free in higher education. It implies if someone gets a spot in a public university, they don't have to pay any kind of fee, tuition, or things like that. For this reason, these days, the society as a whole is expecting to the university a kind of commitment to be more close and to work more engaged on social issues and things like that. And I think that it has created some kinds of, at least, sources for us to change curriculum, to propose something new. I think that research is a great strategy in a large sense. I'm not talking exactly about methods or a systematic training in research, but research as something to discover and to build different types of knowledge that in the case of Brazil, it's not written in books or things like that. If we do like, for example, to study local music, we will not find books or at least a lot of books written about it. We have to write this history, and first of all, we have to research. And we are using our curricula, our classes, our courses to set up this kind of knowledge. And I think that more than the outcomes, and it's good to have these outcomes because we are writing a lot of papers about Brazilian music. This process has been so interesting for our students because they are experiencing a lot of different types of musical repertoires off campus in the context, learning how people play, but how they dance, how they interact with each other, how they eat as a social interaction, and it makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, yeah, that's reminded me of a set of performance grades that London College of Music Exams developed. Not sure how long ago now, but a while back, and the idea was to have a kind of tradition neutral form of grades that allowed people to bring their own repertoire and set the criteria for what constituted a good performance in whatever tradition they brought. So the idea was to allow, rather than part of the issue was that within the African countries that LCM was doing these exam grades in, it was a very important part of musical education to have the piece of paper, to have the, you know, the grade certificate, and what it meant was that people who had access to classical or jazz education could do that much more easily than anyone else, because nobody designs grade systems for I don't know, West African drumming, you know, these the idea was to try and, rather than to try and write sets of grades for every tradition, was to try and create a set of grades that would allow an ensemble to come in and perform. And what was interesting was the question of whether someone from outside of that tradition, who was an LCM examiner who had skills in elsewhere, would be able to assess them or not. That was a kind of really problematic thing. And in the end, they did some experiments with, you know, people who were experts and people who were experts in a different tradition, and generally they gave the same, more or less the same grades to ensembles, because they could identify excellence or they could identify skill, and that skill isn't that different. Once you see someone is consistently doing a particularly odd intonation thing, but they're doing it consistently, you realize, okay, that must be part of their tradition. You've got to be relatively open-minded about it, but it becomes part of the process, and that seems to me to be something that is potential, a potential way of sorry, my dog's sneezing. um, is a potential way of creating more equality through a diversity, but just in terms of qualifications. That's quite a it is quite an important aspect. Those those of us who have access to qualifications kind of forget about the problem of actual access to the different types of paperwork. Any other thoughts on that?
Hey, Simon, I just would like to mention that because of the coronavirus pandemic, I think that people, especially musicians and music professors, are realizing that we have a lot of things to change in our undergraduate and graduate programs, because right now everyone is trying to incorporate some new technologies, is trying to learn new strategies to teach music performance by using digital platforms. A lot of things like that linked to diversity that we are talking about in some sense, that in the past was considered like a debate not so important to the field of music. It's something like has no way to teach someone to be a great performer. We have to be it one-on-one class by using traditional ways to teach. And right now, all of these professors are pretty open to incorporate some new strategies, to read the strategies, to set up curricula differently. And I think that we have a great motivation to change, because people are willing to do different, at least because they realized that the way that we've been teaching for a long time is not enough to attend this new world.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that relates a bit to Karishma's point about access, about the prohibitive cost of UK music education, and that given that Cambridge have put all of their courses online for the next year, that makes you kind of consider, well, what does that say about access to education from in a transcultural sense? So going back to Britta's transculturalism in terms of processes as well as repertoire, that transcultural processes of communication, as you say, this kind of we've all been thrown into new modes of communication that are exposing the fact that we can open up our education system in a different way. Obviously not in an entirely online sense, but that there are techniques that we can use. And I think the other thing that's been interesting for me is partly to do with what's happened with this conference, but also with a few other little initiatives that have been happening, is the idea of universities sorry, sneezing dog, is the idea of universities collaborating much more in terms of actual teaching, not just in terms of research activities, but actually of delivering content in, swapping lectures, providing mutual content that people can get access to. I think that's an interesting thing. That's thanks, Juan Pablo. I shall tell him later. Yeah, has anybody got any questions Has anybody got any questions? Um, well, for any of us about the topic, because we're getting close to 8 o'clock now, and uh, or have any of the panelists got any things that they want to add?
Well, I noticed there was an interesting comment in the chat regarding introducing visual aesthetics and things like sociocultural elements. And I think that's going to be an important, well, it's important now, but it's going to become even more important in the future, especially as we have to use various technological media to deliver the material and convey thoughts about it. Also, for a place like MTSU, with its Department of Recording Industry, for those on the audio production side, the technology creates a new kind of barrier if your education is supposed to be premised on a hands-on experience and a more direct, tactile familiarity and relationship with equipment and an experiential background engagement with that equipment. So those are just two other points there.
Yeah, and Hetty's. Oh, Loudon, you've just mentioned exactly the same thing. That the point of the processes being used to actually undercut academic pay and jobs and all of the above, basically. I mean, it is a very double-edged sword what's happening at the moment, because certainly you can kind of see bean counters rubbing their hands together in universities as they see partly what's happening and thinking of ways, rather than thinking of ways of making the experience better, it's about making the experience cheaper. Cheaper to deliver anyway, not necessarily to pay for. We seem to have lost Lewis. Oh, he's just switched his camera off.
Yes, I had a connection problem. Sorry about
okay. Any sort of final points? IP, yes, exactly. Loudon, IP is a very interesting point that I think at our place the university's been asked. The union has been asked to kind of look into that question a little bit, but yeah. So, okay, any last thoughts from people before we listen to some music?
Well, just perhaps the idea that, I was just returning to another strand of thought from a little earlier, but it's just the idea that when we talk about or consider transforming curriculum, we need to be very consciously aware of the cultural variety or lack thereof in our student base, and also the ways in which they perceive, as Loudon referred to, the transactional nature of education. These things have a direct impact on what we are able to offer and the kind of transformation that we can bring about in terms of curriculum.
Nice. I just would like to mention that I think that diversity is part of the world. I mean, the real musical life is diversified, is diverse. And so I believe that include diversity into our curriculum as a whole is not an option these days. And it is something vital to make our musical programs relevant, to make our music programs connect with the world, connect better with the times and things like that. I think that it is what we discovered in Brazil. It's like for a long time, we had like the musical world outside the university and a kind of institutional world that just existed into the universities. And we were suffering a lot to keep this structure working well. And these days, I believe that we have this perception to keep the canons, if we would like to do that in some sense, we have to incorporate diversity as part of the curricula, because the society is completely diverse, the musical life is diverse, and the university, the music programs, the curricula have to be as well. I think that it is the perspective that we have in Brazil, and for this reason, we've been trying to change things a lot as a way to survive. And I think that this perspective is much important for Latin American countries, but I believe that for the entire world.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I'm just reading Juan Pablo's comment. Yeah, yeah. I suppose I don't know why I'm having closing remarks, but because I'm meant to be just asking questions, but I'm going to have some anyway. I mean, I think, you know, we've all kind of said not so much that we want there to be a canon as such, but that our job is to guide people to explore a wider variety of materials that becomes canon-like in some way, because that's the way of the world. That's the way, you know, we can only have a certain number of things happening at once, and we can only, you know, there's only so much room in the curriculum. I think that idea that all of us have kind of talked about in a lot of ways is about encouraging students to look at the history of what they're into, and also look at, you know, point out connections to what they're into to places that might be invisible to them at the moment for whatever reasons. And that seems to be a kind of good point to end on.